In the hive schools of Terra, children are molded not to think, but to obey. Yet when one student asks the wrong question, the lesson turns into something no textbook could explain. The bell didn't ring so much as scream. A shrill metallic shriek that vibrated through bone and mind alike, signaling the start of another day of sanctioned learning. 11-year-old Rin Ocelli rose from his cot before the second echo faded, because hesitation, any hesitation, was dangerous here. The dormitory was a steel box filled with rows of identical bunks, each one holding a child shaped by hunger, duty, and fear. Above them, the words obedience is knowledge, knowledge is faith, faith is life glowed in pale lumen letters, their flicker synchronized to the rhythm of the bell. He folded his sleeping cloth with trembling precision. The monitors, servo skulls with whirring optics and metal wings, hovered between the bunks, scanning for imperfection. The hum of their engines was the sound of authority. One paused near his cot, lenses adjusting. Rin held his breath until it drifted away. Then he exhaled, silently thanking the Emperor, though he wasn't sure why. When the children filed into the corridor, they did so in perfect order, bare feet slapping against the cold metal floor. No one spoke. No one ever did. Speech outside of assigned recitation was a punishable inefficiency. The corridor walls pulsed faintly, veins of power running beneath the surface. Somewhere deeper in the hive, machines the size of cathedrals groaned and turned. Classroom 44 Gamma was like every other. Rows of metal desks, one lumen strip overhead, the smell of disinfectant and recycled air. At the front, Instructrix Vale stood rigid as a statue. Her uniform was black, adorned only with the sigil of the administratum. Her voice, when she spoke, was sharp enough to cut metal. Pupils, begin the litany of gratitude. Dozens of small voices rose in unison. We thank the Emperor for his wisdom sustains us. We thank the Imperium for its order protects us. We thank our instructors for their guidance purifies us. Good, Vale said. Her eyes were like lenses, flat, reflective, unblinking. Today's lesson, the history of mankind's salvation. Open your text units to section Primus, verse 3. The class obeyed. Pages flickered to life with sanctioned data. Images of the Great Crusade, the Emperor's golden figure leading endless armies across the stars, filled the thin hollow slates. It was a story every child knew before they could speak, a story older than any of them could comprehend. Rin watched the shimmering projection of the Emperor's face, serene, merciless, eternal, and wondered, not for the first time, if it was true. Vale paced between the rows, the sound of her boots echoing. What lesson do we take from the age of strife? She asked. A dozen hands shot up. She chose a girl near the front. That mankind fell because of ignorance, instructor, because we turned from faith and sought knowledge unblessed. Vale nodded. Correct. Unblessed knowledge is corruption. Curiosity is the path to ruin. Remember that, children. The Emperor's wisdom is sufficient for all. Rin hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. Something inside him, a faint spark that hadn't yet been crushed, whispered that there must be more. He raised his hand. The motion drew every eye in the room. Vale's expression froze for half a second, then softened into something almost like amusement. Yes, pupil Ocelli. He swallowed. Instructor, if the Emperor knows everything, why do we still need to learn? The silence that followed was so complete it became a sound of its own. The lumen overhead buzzed louder, as if straining to fill the void. Vale's eyes narrowed. Explain yourself. Rin's mouth went dry. He hadn't meant it as defiance. It was genuine confusion born of logic and innocence. I mean, if he already knows and we are his servants, then wouldn't we just do what he knows we'll do? Why learn what's already decided? A tremor passed through the room. Several pupils crossed themselves with the Aquila. Vale approached slowly, her boots clicking like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. When she stopped before him, the scent of incense and machine oil filled his nose. Stand, she ordered. He did. You question doctrine. He shook his head. No, instructor, I. You question doctrine, she repeated, louder this time, as if the statement itself was a litany. Her gloved hand lifted, and one of the servo skulls descended from its perch above, lenses whirring as it scanned his face. Rin's heart pounded. He wanted to apologize, to say he'd been confused, to take it back. But before he could speak, Vale turned to the class. Children, observe. This is why curiosity must be purged. The Emperor teaches through correction. The skull's metal jaw unhinged, revealing a small injector. It hissed once, a puff of sacred vapor. Rin braced for pain, but none came, only cold. A spreading numbness that started at his neck and crept downward. He stumbled back into his desk. The injector retracted, the skull returning to its silent orbit. Vale looked down at him with something resembling pity. Do not fear. You have been chosen for special instruction. He blinked, vision blurring. Special. Yes, she said. The Schola will see what lessons you require. The world tilted. The faces of his classmates blurred together, pale masks in the lumen glow. Then everything went dark. He awoke to the sound of chanting. Not children's voices this time, but the deep, resonant hum of adults repeating ancient phrases. His eyes opened to a room far larger than the classroom. Metal walls, sanctified by engraved scripture. Chains hung from the ceiling, each one attached to a harnessed child. Some awake, some not. Monitors blinked above them, displaying brainwave patterns. Rin tried to move, but found his arms bound. A figure loomed over him. A man this time, his body a latticework of augmetics. Subject Ocelli, the man said, his voice filtered through Vox augmentations. You have displayed the spark of inquiry, uncommon in your cohort. Where am I? Rin croaked. You are in the chamber of correction, the Schola's deeper sanctum. We refine deviation here. The words made no sense. I didn't mean to. Intent is irrelevant, the man said. What matters is purity. You will be tested and your mind will be made clean. Rin looked past him. In the far corner, a girl he recognized, Mara from the earlier class, was connected to a machine through wires running into her temples. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't seeing anything in this world. Her mouth moved, repeating something silently. Maybe prayers, maybe just sounds. The man reached for a control panel. Lesson 1, Understanding Through Pain. The hum deepened, light filled the chamber, and then something else stirred in the machine. Not pain, not yet, something older. The lights flickered once, twice, and Rin felt a presence move through the chamber like cold wind through bones. The adults stopped chanting. Even the servo skulls hesitated. Power fluctuation, the man muttered. Continue the sequence. But Rin's mind wasn't empty. It was filled. Images, impossible and endless, cascaded through his thoughts. The golden throne, oceans of faces chanting his name, the stars burning, the void screaming. He saw a vast figure bound in light and machinery, and for a single heartbeat, he understood something that wasn't meant for human minds. Then it was gone. He screamed, not from pain but from loss. The man beside him stumbled back, alarms flaring. Contain the subject, he shouted. And in the chaos, as hands reached for him, Rin whispered the words that would echo through every corridor of the Schola for weeks to come. He's not sleeping. He's burning. The last thing he saw was the instructrix's face appearing on a nearby hollow screen, her expression unreadable. So, she said softly, the Emperor chose to answer, did he? Then the world went white. When consciousness returned, it did so slowly, like dawn breaking across a poisoned sky. Rin's head throbbed with the ache of overuse, his tongue heavy, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of restraints against his wrists, the cold bite of metal that kept his body anchored to the slab beneath him. The air was dense and smelled of ozone and sterilized decay. He tried to open his eyes, but the world was still hazy, light bleeding through in pale, trembling bands. He thought for a moment he was still in the classroom. that he'd wake to the metallic shriek of the bell and the voice of Instructrix Vale calling for the litany of gratitude. But then the hum returned, the low, rhythmic pulse of the machines, and with it came memory, the chamber of correction, the man's augmetic eyes, the flash of light, and the vision that had carved itself into his skull like a brand. The Emperor not as the serene figure from the hollow texts, but as something vast and burning, a sun trapped in a cage of machinery, a god chained by his own divinity. He'd seen him, not in light but in agony. He gasped and forced his eyes open. The chamber was quieter now, almost peaceful. The other children were gone, replaced by silence and shadow. The only movement came from the faint shimmer of incense smoke drifting from brass censers mounted on the walls. He strained against his bonds, but they held fast. Above him, a single lumen burned with sickly yellow light, flickering just enough to cast shifting patterns across his face. "Do not struggle," said a voice from the darkness. It was calm, almost kind. "You've survived the first stage. That is unusual." The speaker stepped into view. A woman this time, tall, dressed not in the strict uniform of an instructrix, but in flowing crimson robes. Her face was partially obscured by a golden half-mask shaped like a serene expression frozen in time. Her right eye was human, green and sharp, while the left gleamed with the faint red glow of augmentation. "Who are you?" Rin whispered. "I am Magos Didraki," she replied, voice echoing softly. "Chief of Cognitive Correction. You are Ocelli Rin, designation Gamma 44, yes." He nodded weakly. "You asked a question," she said, "and for that you've seen what no child should see." He hesitated. Was it real? For a moment the mask hid her expression, but her human eye betrayed something like discomfort. Reality is a complex word, child. What you witnessed was not meant for unmodified minds. But you are alive, which means the Emperor did not strike you down for heresy. Perhaps that is a sign. She turned away, moving toward a nearby console. The light from its runes bathed her in faint blue glow. "Tell me, Rin Ocelli, when you saw him, what did you feel?" He tried to find the words, but everything he thought to say felt wrong. "It hurt," he said finally. "Not just my head. It hurt like being too small to understand something too big, like he was burning so we wouldn't." Key froze, then she turned and her single green eye met his. "Burning," she repeated softly. "That's what you said before you blacked out. He's not sleeping, he's burning." "I saw it," Rin said, trembling. "The light, it wasn't light, it was pain. All that power, all that faith, holding something together that wants to die." The Magos's expression was unreadable. She reached into her robes and withdrew a small device, placing it against his temple. There was a faint click, then warmth. "We'll need to examine your mind," she said. "What you've seen is not meant for memory. But before we do," she paused, and for a brief instant he thought she might actually feel pity. "Do you believe what you saw?" He swallowed. "I don't know." She nodded as if that were the right answer. "Then there's hope for you yet." The device hissed. The world tilted again. He tried to speak, but words failed. His vision blurred, and before he could draw another breath, darkness claimed him again. When he woke this time, it was not in chains. He lay on a cot in a smaller room, bare metal walls, one lumen, a data slate on a nearby desk. His clothes had been replaced with a plain gray robe. His body ached, but his mind felt sharper somehow, as if the pain had been refined into clarity. The door opened with a hiss. A figure entered carrying a small tray. It was Instructrix Vale. He sat up too fast, nearly knocking the tray over. "Instructor." "Eat," she said, placing the tray on the table. "You'll need strength." Rin hesitated, staring at the ration paste. "Where am I?" Vale took a seat across from him. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked tired. The hard lines around her mouth had softened, the perfect posture slightly relaxed. "You are in Section Omega of the Schola. Few ever see this place." "I don't understand. Why am I here?" You saw something you weren't meant to, she said quietly. And you survived. That means the Mechanicus wants to know why. He frowned. Am I in trouble? A humorless smile touched her lips. That depends on what you tell them. He glanced at the tray again, then at her. Instructor, what is sacred service? Her eyes flickered with surprise, then caution. Who told you that phrase? The Magos. She said I might have been chosen. Vale exhaled, leaning back. You should forget that. It's not for children to know. But I'm not. Rin, she interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp again. Do not speak of it, promise me. Something in her voice made him stop. He nodded slowly. I promise. She looked away toward the door. Finish your food. The Magos will return soon. Whatever you saw, whatever you think it means, don't repeat it. Not to her, not to anyone. Why? Because in this place, Vale said softly, truth can kill you faster than heresy. Hours passed before the door opened again. This time 2 figures entered. The Magos was one, the other was taller, clad in armor the color of dull gold, a red cloak trailing behind him. His face was concealed by a helm shaped like an eagle's beak. Even without seeing his eyes, Rin could feel them on him, ancient, heavy with judgment. This is the child, the armored man asked. His voice was deep but not cruel. Yes, Lord Custodian, Key replied. He endured psychic exposure to the throne's projection, unfiltered, and he retained consciousness. The custodian regarded Rin for a long moment. Few untrained minds survive such contact. Fewer still remain coherent. I'm not special, Rin said, before realizing how foolish it sounded. The custodian tilted his head slightly, as if examining a curiosity. The Emperor chooses as he wills, he said. Perhaps you were meant to see. Key gestured toward the console. May we begin? The custodian gave a curt nod. Proceed, but if there's corruption. I will purge it, she said simply. Rin's hands clenched in his lap. He wanted to run, to scream, but he stayed still as the Magos placed the device on his head once more. Breathe, she said. Do not fight it. Light exploded behind his eyes. The walls melted into patterns of light and shadow. He felt himself falling not through space but through thought. Voices echoed all around him, whispers layered upon whispers. Duty, faith, service, obedience. Then came the images again, the same burning figure, the same cage of light. But this time something was different. He saw beyond the machinery into the infinite void. He saw billions of souls streaming toward the throne like rivers of fire, feeding it, sustaining it. And amidst that torrent he felt a pull, a thread connecting him directly to that vast, suffering consciousness. He reached out. For a moment the presence looked back. Child, it said, not in words but in the language of thought and agony. What do they teach you? Rin's breath caught. They teach us not to ask. Then ask, the voice said, and see. Pain tore through him. His vision filled with stars bursting and collapsing. He saw planets burning, cities drowning, armies kneeling before altars that bled light. He saw the Imperium, endless, unyielding, and realized it all existed to keep one thing alive. One thing that could never die, because if it did, all of humanity would follow. When his eyes opened again, the room was chaos. Sparks rained from the ceiling. The Magos was shouting. The custodian had drawn his blade, its tip glowing with psychic flame. Rin's restraints were gone, melted clean through by some unseen force. What did you see? The custodian demanded. Rin's lips trembled. He didn't know how to answer, because there were no words for what he'd seen, only one truth that he couldn't contain. The Emperor, he said hoarsely, he's not just protecting us, he's begging us not to stop. The custodian took a step forward, his presence filling the room like a storm. What does that mean? Rin met his gaze, or where his gaze would have been, and whispered, it means he's still fighting, and he's losing. The lumen overhead shattered. Every console in the chamber went black. Somewhere deep below, an alarm began to sound. The custodian turned sharply to the Magos. "Contain this." But she was staring at Rin, her expression unreadable. "No," she said quietly, "he's not the one to contain." Rin felt the world shift again. Reality folded, light bending, space trembling. And in that flicker of impossible illumination, he heard the voice again, no longer distant but inside him. "Find the others who still dream. The light fades, they must learn." Then the chamber tore apart in a bloom of fire and screaming metal. When Rin next opened his eyes, he was no longer in the Schola. The walls were stone now, cracked and scorched. The air smelled of dust and burned ozone. Through the broken ceiling, he could see the sky, a rare glimpse of Terra's polluted heavens. In the distance, alarms wailed. A servo skull buzzed past overhead, sparking erratically, and beside him, half buried under debris, the Magos stirred. She coughed, blood and machine oil mingling. "You survived," she said. Rin tried to stand. "What happened?" "The throne," she rasped. "Something resonated when you touched it. The psychic backlash burned through half the conduits beneath this sector." He looked around. The custodian was nowhere to be seen. Only the faint impression of golden armor, melted into the stone, remained. "What do we do?" Rin asked. Key's remaining eye flickered toward him. "We hide," she said, "and we listen, because whatever spoke to you, it wasn't supposed to." Then she laughed softly, bitterly. "And now, child, the lesson begins anew." The tunnels beneath the Schola were not meant for human passage. They were arteries of maintenance and machinery, thick with cables, condensation, and the constant, low hum of power that bled through the walls. Rin followed Mago's Key through the dark, his bare feet splashing through shallow pools of oil and water, the air thick with metal and dust. Her crimson robes were torn, one sleeve missing, her exposed arm entirely mechanical from shoulder to fingertip. She moved with purpose, each step precise, as if she'd walked this route many times before. The lumen strapped to her wrist flickered weakly, casting their shadows in long, distorted shapes against the walls. Rin said nothing for a long time. His throat still burned from smoke, and his head throbbed with the lingering echo of that impossible light, the one that had spoken to him, the one that had felt like the Emperor himself reaching into his mind. He wasn't sure how much of it had been real, and how much had been the aftermath of the cognitive correction the Magos had forced upon him. When he finally spoke, his voice came out small, uncertain. "Where are we going?" "Down," Key answered without looking back. "To where the administratum forgot to look. Below the learning halls, below the data crypts, there are older structures, places left behind after the Unification Wars. The Schola was built on their bones." "Older." "Older than the Imperium," she said quietly. "Older than what your kind calls history." Rin frowned. "My kind." She turned slightly, and for the first time he saw her human eye clearly again. It was tired but still sharp, gleaming beneath the grime. "You still think of yourself as a student of the Schola," she said. "But the moment you touched the throne's echo, you ceased to be that. You were marked." He remembered the burning light, the voice that had filled his mind. "Find the others who still dream." The words hadn't faded since the explosion. They lingered in his thoughts like an infection. "What does it mean?" he asked. Key did not answer immediately. The tunnel narrowed, forcing her to duck beneath a cluster of tangled conduits. The lumen light shone across a sigil carved into the stone, a small, simple sunburst with a single eye in its center. Rin recognized it from the older catechisms, one rarely spoken of now. "You were taught to revere the Emperor as a god," Key said at last. "But the first students of Terra learned something different. They were taught that the Emperor was a teacher, a guide, that he wanted humanity to think, to question, to build." She paused, gloved fingers brushing the ancient sigil. "Then came the wars of faith. The priests rose, the thinkers vanished, and the truth was buried." Rin blinked, trying to process her words. You mean, what they teach us now, it's wrong? Qi let out a dry, bitter laugh. Wrong? No, convenient. There is a difference. She started walking again. The Imperium is built on obedience. Obedience keeps order, but you, child, you asked the wrong question. And that means you still think. That's more dangerous than any heresy. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavernous space. Massive stone pillars supported a ceiling lost to darkness. Old banners hung in tatters, their symbols faded by time. Humming generators lined one wall, and near their dim light, Rin could make out the faint shapes of tables, machines, and books, actual books, stacked in precarious towers. This is, he began, unable to finish. The archive, Qi said, stepping forward. The Mechanicus calls it an anomaly, the ecclesiarchy calls it a blasphemy, but to some of us it's a sanctuary. Rin followed her toward a large console where an old man sat hunched over, his face hidden by the hood of a threadbare robe. His hands were cybernetic, slender and skeletal, their joints hissing faintly as he turned the pages of a thick tome written in symbols Rin didn't recognize. Qi cleared her throat. Archivist Loran, she said, we require sanctuary. The man looked up. His eyes were pale, his skin like parchment, but there was intelligence in the way he studied them. I felt the surge, he said. His voice was thin but steady. Something shook the conduits above. Was that your doing, Magos? Not mine, Qi said, placing a hand on Rin's shoulder. His. The archivist's gaze shifted to the boy. For a moment, Rin felt exposed, like the old man could see straight through him, reading every thought and secret in his mind. Then Loran nodded. I see, he murmured. Another awakened. Rin frowned, awakened. Loran gestured for him to sit on a nearby crate. Do you know what the Schola truly is, child? Rin hesitated. It's where we learn to serve the Emperor. The archivist smiled faintly. That's what they tell you, but the Schola is not only a school, it is a sieve, a filter. They teach obedience to most, but they watch for the few who resist it, the ones whose minds break the mold. Those few are marked as failures, or more rarely as candidates for sacred service. He leaned closer, and sometimes they are brought here. Qi interjected quietly. The Mechanicus calls them cognitive aberrants. The ecclesiarchy calls them sinners. I call them what they are, thinkers, the last remnants of what the Emperor wanted humanity to be. Rin stared between them, his thoughts spinning. You're saying the Emperor wanted us to think, but all they ever taught us was to obey. Loran chuckled softly. Exactly, they teach what's safe. Thought is not safe. He stood slowly, the mechanical joints in his legs creaking. When the Emperor walked Terra before he ascended the throne, he built schools like this one not to chain minds but to free them. He believed knowledge was humanity's greatest weapon, but after his ascension, the priests changed the lesson. They turned the classroom into a chapel, and every question became a sin. The word struck Rin harder than any blow. For his whole life, he had believed that knowledge was granted by the Emperor, not hidden from him. Now he saw the faces of his teachers, the hollow repetition of litanies, the endless memorization of doctrines, and realized that none of it had ever taught him to understand, only to repeat. Qi placed a small, dust-covered slate in front of him. Its screen flickered to life, displaying symbols he'd never seen before. These, she said, are fragments of the pre-imperial teachings. We've kept them safe for centuries. They were forbidden by the second decree of the ecclesiarch Decimian, but I think you'll find them enlightening. Rin stared at the lines of text. They weren't prayers. They were questions. Each line ended not with a period but with a mark he didn't recognize, a curling symbol like an open gate. What is this? He asked. It's a catechism, Loran said, smiling. But not one you recite, it's one you answer. He leaned closer. Tell me, Rin, what do schools teach in the Imperium? He hesitated. Faith. And obedience, Qi added. Correct, said Loran. But what did they teach before the Imperium? Rin frowned, thinking. The light from the slate reflected in his eyes. Truth, he whispered. Loran's smile widened. You see, you already know. The chamber trembled then, a deep, rolling vibration that rattled dust from the ceiling. Key's head snapped up. They're scanning, she said. Custodian patrols. They must have traced the energy surge. Loran moved toward the wall, activating a series of runes. You'll need to move. There's a secondary access tunnel beneath the east platform. Key looked to Rin. Can you walk? He nodded, though his legs trembled. Before they could leave, Loran pressed something into Rin's hand, a small metallic object shaped like a fragment of an aquila, smooth and cold. Keep this with you, he said. It's encoded with the coordinates of others like you. Not all are on Terra. Rin stared at the piece. Others. Loran's pale eyes softened. The dreamers, the ones who still see the Emperor not as a god but as a guide. They're scattered, hidden. Some think they're mad, some are hunted, but all of them are waiting. The rumbling grew louder. Distant lights flared red. Key grabbed Rin's arm and pulled him toward the platform. As they ran, Rin looked back one last time. The archivist was already returning to his console, hands moving over the controls. Go, he called. Knowledge lives longer when it runs. Then the ceiling split open. A beam of white light speared down through the dust. Voices shouted, mechanical, sharp, custodian guards. Rin stumbled as Key pushed him toward a hatch. The last thing he saw before the door sealed was the archivist turning toward the light, arms raised, not in surrender but in defiance. The hatch slammed shut. Darkness swallowed them again. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. In the pitch black of the lower tunnels, time lost meaning. Key moved ahead, her mechanical arm lighting faintly as she pressed along the corridor. Rin followed, still clutching the metal fragment. The words of the archivist echoed in his mind, the dreamers, the ones still waiting. At last they emerged into another chamber. This one was different, smaller, round, filled with old screens and broken terminals. Faded murals covered the walls, depicting robed figures around a glowing sun. The center of the room held a single object, a cracked globe of glass, suspended by wires, within which faint golden motes drifted like embers. This, Key said quietly, is what remains of a learning node, the kind the Emperor built himself. She moved closer, brushing the dust from the globe. Every one of these once connected to thousands of others across Terra. They shared knowledge freely, ideas, art, science. Now it's all gone, all except this. Rin watched the lights swirl inside. It's beautiful. Beauty, she said softly, was once part of learning too. For a moment neither of them spoke. The air hummed faintly, and in that hum Rin thought he heard whispers again, faint, almost musical. Ask, learn, build, remember. He shivered. Magos, he said slowly, it's speaking. Key looked at him sharply. What did it say? He repeated the words. She frowned, then touched the glass. The motes swirled faster, drawn toward her hand. Impossible, she muttered. The node's power core should have decayed centuries ago. Then the lights began to form shapes, letters, words, in the air between them. The light FADES, the lesson ENDURES. Key stepped back, eyes wide. It's responding to you. Rin felt the pull again, the same as when he'd touched the throne's echo. The voice in his head whispered, find them, teach them. What's happening to me? He asked, his voice trembling. Key's gaze met his. The Emperor's light passes through all humanity, she said. But for some it burns brighter. You're not cursed, Rin, you're remembering. The globe flared, flooding the chamber with golden light. For an instant, Rin saw images within it. A vast hall filled with children not kneeling in prayer but standing around glowing diagrams. Men and women teaching, questioning, laughing. He saw stars, books, art, everything that had once been. Then it vanished, the glass shattering into dust. The silence that followed was deafening. Key looked at him, her voice low and steady. You've just seen the first classroom of mankind. Rin swallowed hard. Then why did we forget? Her expression darkened. Because power fears knowledge, and the Imperium learned long ago that obedient faith is easier to rule than curious minds. She turned toward the corridor. But now they'll come for us. The custodians will not allow another awakening. Rin looked down at the metal fragment in his hand. Then we find the others. Key nodded, and we rebuild what was lost. Somewhere above them, alarms began again, shrill and relentless. The walls trembled with the sound of descending drop pods. Rin took a breath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the noise. He was afraid of forgetting. He followed Key into the dark. And as they vanished into the tunnels, a faint golden glow lingered on the cracked stone where the learning node had shattered, as though the light itself refused to die. The tunnels bled into the old maintenance arteries beneath the Scalem, corridors so ancient even the Adeptus Mechanicus had stopped cataloging them centuries ago. The air grew thicker the deeper they went, humid, metallic, almost alive. The hum of the hive above was distant here, replaced by a steady mechanical heartbeat that pulsed through the metal under their feet. Every few minutes the lights would flicker, revealing inscriptions on the walls. Faded prayers, half-buried circuit lines, or old imperial codes no one had used since the dawn of the Imperium. Rin followed closely behind Mago's Key, his fingers still wrapped around the metallic shard Loran had given him. The shard vibrated faintly now, as if reacting to something deeper below. He didn't dare ask why. He could feel his mind shifting, his thoughts stretching in strange directions since the light from the learning node had touched him. His memories came clearer, sharper, yet some didn't feel like his own. Sometimes he caught glimpses of faces he'd never seen before. Children in classrooms filled with sunlight instead of lumens, teachers who spoke softly instead of shouting litanies. Other times, he saw things he couldn't understand, vast machines orbiting stars, men and women floating in voids surrounded by radiant halos of light. Each vision left him shaken, but also hungry. Key stopped suddenly. Her augmetic hand hovered over a large, rusted door at the end of the corridor. The door was sealed with heavy chains, and across it someone had painted words in dried oil-black letters. All questions end here. Do you know what this place is? Rin asked. Yes, Key said. It's one of the old archives. Long before the ecclesiarchy seized control of the Scalem system, this chamber was a vault for forbidden records, documents, data cores, genetic memories. It's been sealed for over 4,000 years. Why are we going in? Because answers don't end here, she said quietly, no matter how many chains they use. Her mechanical hand tightened. Sparks leapt from her fingertips as she began cutting through the lock with a hiss of plasma. The air filled with the smell of burning metal. Rin shielded his face until the final chain snapped loose and fell to the floor. The door groaned open, exhaling a gust of stale air that smelled of dust and time. Beyond the threshold was a hall far larger than he'd expected, rows of shelves rising higher than he could see, filled with both data slates and old, crumbling paper tomes. Servolamps flickered overhead like dying stars. The silence was immense. Every footstep echoed like a prayer. Key approached the nearest shelf, brushing away layers of dust from the spine of a book. The Book of the Forgotten, she murmured, reading the engraved title. These texts were banned after the Third Edict of Purity. They contain records of teaching methods before the Imperial Reformation. Rin frowned. You mean real schools? Key nodded slowly. Real ones, where knowledge was shared, not controlled, where children learned how to build ships and stars, not just how to worship them. He reached for the nearest tome. It was heavy and rough, the pages brittle. Across the first page was a drawing of a circle divided into segments. Inside each one was a symbol, a star, a flame, an eye, and a seed. Beneath it were words written in high Gothic that he could barely read. To know is to serve. To understand is to become. He felt the meaning ripple through him, not as thought, but as something older, an instinct. The shard in his pocket thrummed in response. "What do these symbols mean?" he asked. Key didn't answer. She was already scanning the shelves, pulling down fragments of data cores, whispering to herself in bursts of binary cant. The Emperor wasn't the first teacher, she muttered. There were others before him, philosophers, scientists, builders. He united them, forged their wisdom into something purer, but he never meant for it to become this cage. Rin turned the pages faster, eyes widening. Each illustration was stranger than the last. Diagrams of human anatomy interwoven with circuitry, solar systems mapped like mathematical theorems, entire languages made of geometric shapes. Then he found something that made his blood run cold. A list names, thousands of them. Beside each name was a small notation in red ink: purged M40, absorbed M32, erased M36. Key looked over his shoulder. "The teachers," she said, "every one of them, eliminated once the ecclesiarchy decided that questioning the scriptures was heresy." Rin's throat tightened. "So they killed them all." "They erased them," Key said. "It's cleaner that way. You don't need to kill ideas if you make everyone forget they ever existed." Her words hung heavy in the air. Rin looked around at the shelves and thought about all the years he'd spent memorizing catechisms and litanies, words that had meant nothing but survival. Here, in the silence, he could feel how much had been stolen from them, how much had been buried. He stepped deeper into the vault, drawn by a faint light flickering near the center. There, on a pedestal, rested a small orb, similar to the learning node from before but older, its glass clouded by time. It pulsed softly with a dim golden glow. "Magos," he called. Key turned, eyes narrowing. "Don't touch it." But before she could finish, Rin's hand brushed the surface. The vault exploded with light. Images poured into his mind, not visions but memories. 1,000 classrooms filled with children, teachers of every kind, voices teaching math, language, science, music, not prayers, lessons. The sheer beauty of it overwhelmed him. He saw the Emperor himself, not on a throne of gold, but standing before a class of children beneath a sunlit sky, smiling as he asked them questions. Questions, not commands. Then the vision changed. Fire, priests in black robes burning the books, the children screaming as soldiers dragged them away. The golden light extinguished one vault at a time, and above it all the Emperor's face, still smiling but fading, replaced by the iron mask of the ecclesiarchy. Rin fell to his knees. "He wanted us to learn," he whispered. "He wanted us to know." Key knelt beside him, one mechanical hand resting on his shoulder. "Now you understand why they fear you." The orb dimmed, but the glow lingered around Rin's skin, faint and warm. The shard in his hand vibrated violently, projecting a small holographic map into the air. Points of light appeared across it, dozens, maybe hundreds scattered across the galaxy. "What is that?" Key asked, staring. Rin's eyes widened. "Coordinates," he said, "of other schools." Key's mechanical fingers tightened. "Impossible. The ecclesiarchy purged them centuries ago." "Then why are they still glowing?" Before Key could answer, the ground trembled. A low roar echoed through the tunnel entrance. Red lights flared along the ceiling. "They've found us," Key hissed. "We need to move now." They ran. Rin clutched the shard close to his chest as the vault around them began to shake. Servo skulls descended from vents like mechanical locusts, their eyes glowing crimson. Lasfire ripped through the darkness, cutting through shelves and ancient books alike. The smell of burning parchment filled the air. Key swung her arm, releasing a burst of static from her augmetic limb that shorted several skulls at once. Sparks rained down. "Move!" she shouted. Rin dove behind a column as another beam scorched the floor beside him. The holographic map flickered, dimming but not disappearing. He caught glimpses of worlds, names half familiar, half forgotten. Gathai's Prime, Nova Eridani, Luxor IX. Magos, he cried. There are others, people like us. Key's eyes flashed as she tore open a service hatch. Then we'll find them if we live long enough. They slipped through the narrow crawlspace just as the vault doors collapsed behind them. The explosions shockwave threw them forward. When Rin opened his eyes again, he was staring up at a shaft of faint light filtering down through cracks in the ceiling. Key pulled herself upright, smoke rising from her robes. They won't stop, she said. Not now. The custodians, the Schola Administratum, the priests, they'll all want you silenced. You've seen too much. Rin stood, swaying slightly. His ears still rang from the blast. Then we tell others, we show them. Her human eye softened. You think they'll believe you, a child marked as deviant? He looked down at the shard, still glowing faintly. They'll believe the truth when they see it. Key stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then the lesson begins. The surface of Terra was a wasteland of steel and ash. They emerged from a broken ventilation shaft into the cold morning light of the upper hive's edge. The sky was a dull red haze, heavy with industrial smoke. In the distance, the golden towers of the ecclesiarchal district rose like false suns, gleaming in the smog. Key adjusted her cloak, hiding the burns on her augmetic arm. We can't stay here. There are transports still operating along the subspires. If we can reach one, I can get us off-world. Rin nodded, following close as they moved along the ledge. Below them, the hive stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of bridges, pipes, and towers stacked atop one another. He could hear the faint sound of sermons being broadcast from Vox towers miles away, voices preaching obedience to the Emperor. Every word now sounded hollow. As they neared the edge of a service platform, Rin saw movement ahead, 3 figures, cloaked in black, waiting near an abandoned transport pod. They carried staffs marked with the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus. Key stopped. Witch hunters, she whispered. They've already anticipated our route. What do we do? She looked around quickly. We go down. Before Rin could ask what she meant, Key grabbed him and leapt over the railing. Wind roared around them as they fell through the hive's lower levels, past bridges and machinery into the gloom below. For a moment, Rin thought they'd fall forever. Then Key fired a grapnel from her augmetic arm, the cable jerking them to a stop. They swung hard, slamming into the side of a tower before landing on a narrow walkway. Rin gasped for air. Are we alive for now? She looked upward. But they'll keep following, they don't stop. Why? He asked quietly. Why does the Imperium fear knowledge so much? She looked out over the endless sprawl of the hive, her voice barely above a whisper. Because knowledge is the one thing the Emperor can't control anymore. The words hit him like a blade. For a moment he couldn't speak. The thought was blasphemy, but also truth. The Emperor's light was meant to free humanity, not bind it. Somewhere that purpose had been twisted into something monstrous. Key turned to him. Rin, listen to me. What you saw in that vault, the coordinates, they're not just data, they're a network. Each one connects to another world where fragments of old knowledge still survive. If we can reach them, maybe we can start again. Start again. She nodded, rebuild what was lost. Before he could answer, the air above them shimmered with the sound of engines. Searchlights cut through the haze, sweeping across the lower platforms. They're here, Key said. Run. They fled into the lower passages, their footsteps echoing through the rusted steel. The light behind them grew brighter, closer, until the roar of gunfire drowned everything else. And as they vanished into the depths of the hive, Rin realized that the real lesson of the Imperium wasn't obedience or fear. It was survival. And those who learned too well would one day teach again. The underhive swallowed them whole. Down here, beneath the layers of the city no one remembered, it was always dark. The light from above never reached this deep, and even sound seemed to move slower, as if the air itself was tired of carrying echoes. It smelled of oil and death and time. For Rin, every breath felt like drawing ghosts into his lungs. But the shard still pulsed in his hand, steady, rhythmic, like a heart that refused to die. Mago's key moved ahead, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of her augmetic eye. She never stumbled, never hesitated, as if the maze of the underhive were her own bloodstream. Rin followed in silence, his mind replaying the visions from the vault, the classrooms, the laughter, the Emperor standing in sunlight instead of fire. It seemed impossible that those memories could be real, but the shard didn't lie. And if even half of what he'd seen still existed somewhere in the galaxy, then there was something worth saving. They stopped near a collapsed bridge that overlooked an abyss of shadow. The chasm below was filled with faint, glowing mist, slowly rising and falling like the breath of some sleeping god. The metal structure above them creaked as machinery shifted miles overhead. "We're close," Key said, pulling a small device from her robes. It projected a flickering holomap that matched the one Rin had seen before, only now, a single point on it pulsed brighter than the rest. "What is it?" he asked. "One of the coordinates from the vault," she said. "It's transmitting something, a signal." "A signal from here?" Key nodded. "From beneath here, the dreamers." Rin frowned. "Who are they?" Her mechanical jaw shifted slightly, as if she disliked the word she was about to speak. "Survivors of the old Skalams. They fled underground generations ago. They've been hiding ever since, passing on fragments of forbidden knowledge in secret. They're why the Administratum still sends purifiers into the underhive every decade to root them out." "So they're teachers." "In a way," Key said softly, "but they've become something more than that. They're the last memory of what humanity used to be before obedience became truth." Rin's heart quickened. "Then we need to find them." "We will," she said, and for the first time there was something like hope in her voice. They crossed the broken bridge carefully, moving along a narrow beam until they reached another tunnel. The air grew colder, almost electric. Every few meters, Rin could see inscriptions carved into the walls, not prayers this time, but equations, fragments of languages, snippets of poetry. It was as if the stone itself had become a textbook for those who still remembered how to think. At the end of the passage stood a heavy door marked with an ancient sigil, a circle divided into 4 symbols: the star, the flame, the eye, and the seed. The same symbols he'd seen in the Book of the Forgotten. "It's them," Key whispered, "the original code of the first educators." Rin reached out and pressed the shard against the center of the sigil. The metal trembled. A deep, resonant tone filled the tunnel. The door split apart with a hiss of air, revealing a vast chamber beyond. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The room was enormous, carved into the stone of the hive itself. Hundreds of old cogitators and data conduits lined the walls, humming softly. But what caught his eye were the people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, gathered around dim fires or glowing terminals. They wore no uniforms, no sigils of loyalty. Some were children, others old men and women with eyes bright and clear. Every face turned toward them as they entered, and in those faces, Rin saw something he hadn't seen since the visions in the vault: curiosity. A tall woman approached, her robe stitched from scavenged fabrics. Her hair was streaked with silver and her left eye glowed faintly blue. She studied Rin, then Key. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "They'll have followed you." "They already have," Key replied. "But we didn't come for shelter, we came for truth." The woman's gaze lingered on the shard in Rin's hand. "You carry the spark," she murmured. "Where did you find it?" "In a vault under the Skalam," Rin said. "It showed me what schools used to be." At that the chamber stirred. Whispers rippled through the gathered dreamers. The woman's expression softened. "Then you've seen the beginning." "The beginning of what?" Rin asked. "The beginning of us," she said. "Before the Emperor's dream was stolen, before the ecclesiarchy turned knowledge into chains." She led them deeper into the chamber, past workbenches cluttered with fragments of old technology and hand-copied manuscripts. Children were learning to write on scraps of metal and plastic, not reciting litanies but building sentences. Rin stopped to watch one boy sketch the shape of a star and label it, slowly sounding out the words. The sight made his throat tighten. "This is what they fear," the woman said quietly beside him. "Not weapons, not heresy, but this, a child who asks why." They stopped before a large console that dominated the back of the chamber. Its surface was scarred and ancient, but light still pulsed along its edge. "This is where the dreamer's signal originates," the woman said. "We've been transmitting it for centuries, hidden in the subfrequencies of hive traffic. It carries fragments of the old teachings, encrypted lessons for those who can still decode them. Most think it's just static, but to those who listen," she smiled faintly, "it's a whisper of freedom." Key's eyes glowed. "I can enhance the signal," she said, "amplify it across the planetary Vox net." The woman's face hardened. "If you do, the Inquisition will trace it in minutes." "Let them," Key said. "Truth doesn't survive by hiding." The tension hung in the air like a drawn blade. Rin looked between them, then down at the shard, which pulsed faster now, almost as if responding to their voices. He felt its rhythm in his chest, his head, his bones. The same pulse he'd felt in the vault when the orb had shown him the Emperor teaching under the sun. "What if," he said quietly, "we let it speak for itself?" Key turned to him. "What do you mean?" He held up the shard. "It holds more than just coordinates. It remembers. If we link it to the signal, maybe it can show everyone what I saw." The dreamer leader frowned. "The shard is ancient. It could be unstable if it overloads." "Then it overloads," Rin said. "But if people could see what we've seen, maybe they'll start asking again." Key looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's teach." They placed the shard into the heart of the console. The lights dimmed, then flared so brightly that everyone shielded their eyes. The air vibrated with energy. Then, without warning, images began to bloom across the walls, holograms projected into the misty air of the chamber. Children, teachers, books, sunlight. The Emperor speaking to them not as a god but as a man filled with purpose. His voice echoed softly through the chamber. "To know is to serve. To serve is to uplift. To uplift is to free." Gasps filled the room. Some of the dreamers fell to their knees. Others reached out as if trying to touch the light. The signal spread. Across the hive, Vox units crackled to life. On the streets above, workers paused as static cleared from their speakers, replaced by the same images and the same voice. The Emperor's voice. Children stopped chanting litanies mid-verse. Priests froze as the air around them shimmered with light. The forgotten lessons flooded every channel, every network, every mind tuned to obedience. And above it all, the golden towers of the ecclesiarchal district flared like wounded suns, as their systems overloaded under the wave of unfiltered knowledge. Rin watched, trembling as tears streamed down his face. "It's working," he whispered. Key didn't smile. "No," she said softly, "it's awakening." Alarms began to wail. Across the chamber, dreamers shouted as consoles overheated and sparks rained from the ceiling. The holograms flickered, then fractured into 1,000 shards of light that danced through the smoke. The dreamer leader's voice cut through the chaos. "They're coming. The signal's been traced." Key turned to Rin. "We have to shut it down or they'll find this place." Rin shook his head. "If we shut it down now, it's all for nothing. They'll slaughter everyone here." "Then let them see what they're killing," he shouted. For a moment the chamber froze. The images of the Emperor teaching flickered once more, then stabilized. His eyes seemed to meet Rin's across the ages. "Do not let them forget," the voice said. And then the walls exploded. White fire consumed the chamber. Shockwaves tore through the air. Rin was thrown backward, slamming into stone. His vision went white, then black. When he came to, the world was smoke and silence. Fires burned all around. The dreamers lay scattered, some moving weakly, others still. The signal console was shattered, but the shard remained intact, glowing faintly amidst the wreckage. Rin crawled toward it, coughing. Key was beside him, half buried under debris, her mechanical eye flickering. "Rin," she rasped, "take it, go." He tried to pull her free, but her augmetic leg was crushed under a support beam. "I'm not leaving you." She gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "You're not leaving me, you're continuing me." Her voice softened. "You're the next teacher now." Before he could argue, the sound of armored boots echoed from the tunnel entrance. Dozens of inquisitorial troops advanced through the smoke, their weapons raised, their visors glowing red. Behind them walked a figure in gilded armor, his face hidden by a silver mask shaped like a saint. "By order of the Ordo Hereticus," the figure said, his voice amplified by Vox, "you are charged with dissemination of blasphemous data and corruption of Imperial youth." He raised his hand. "Purge them." Lasfire ripped through the air. Key shoved Rin behind a broken console, taking the blast full in the chest. Her body convulsed, then went still. The last thing she did was press the shard into his hands. "Run," she whispered, and then her eye dimmed to darkness. Rin didn't think, he ran. Through the smoke, through the tunnels, through the screams. He didn't look back until the chamber collapsed behind him, sealing the dreamers forever beneath the hive. When he finally stopped, miles away in the lower ruins, he fell to his knees. The shard pulsed once more, faint but alive, and through his tears he swore he could still hear the Emperor's voice, faint and distant, whispering in the static. "Do not let them forget." He pressed the shard to his chest. "I won't," he said. "I promise." The signal had ended, but its echo was loose in the galaxy now, fragmented, scattered, hidden in the minds of those who had seen. A memory reborn. And somewhere far above, in the spires of the ecclesiarchy, priests gathered around failing Vox systems, terrified by the words that still played faintly through the interference. To know is to serve is to uplift is to free. They tried to shut it down, they couldn't. For 3 days, Rin Ocelli wandered the underhive like a ghost. He slept in the ribs of collapsed hab blocks, drank from rusted pipes, and kept the shard clutched tight in his palm as if it were the last warm thing in existence. Above him, the great hive rumbled and groaned, its titanic machinery never resting. Somewhere in those endless upper levels, the Inquisition was purging, interrogating, silencing. But their reach down here was slow, and the underhive had a way of burying what it didn't wish found. On the 4th day, he woke to a sound that wasn't the hum of engines or the drip of water. It was a voice. "Child." The word was soft, melodic, too soft for this place. He sat up quickly, eyes darting through the gloom. A figure stood a few meters away, cloaked in ragged brown, face hidden beneath a hood. Behind her, faint light shimmered, not from any lumen or fire, but from her skin itself, a faint golden sheen that pulsed gently, like sunlight through water. "Who are you?" Rin asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped closer, and as the hood fell back, he saw her face. Human, but wrong. The eyes burned with a strange inner light, and across her cheeks ran faint lines of circuitry that looked more like veins than implants. "I am one of the Luminarch," she said. "A remnant of the Imperial truth before it was shackled by worship. We've been watching your signal." Rin's heart stuttered. "You saw it." "All of it," she said, kneeling beside him. "The children, the teachings, the voice. You brought light into darkness, boy, but light draws predators." He looked past her into the black tunnels, the endless arteries of the hive. "They'll keep looking, won't they?" "Yes," she said, "but what you started cannot be undone. You've awakened something. People are asking questions again, even up there in the manufactorums and data warrens. The priests are burning books faster than ever, but the words are already in circulation. That is how fire spreads, not from the spark itself, but from those who carry the flame forward." Rin studied her carefully. There was kindness in her expression, but also sadness, a sorrow that seemed ancient. "You said you're Luminarch," he murmured. "What are you really?" She smiled faintly. "Once we were teachers, philosophers, the Emperor's first educators, before the faith turned us into heretics." You knew him." "Not I," she said, "but my forebears did. And through their memories I remember enough to know this. The Emperor never wanted gods. He wanted thinkers, builders, children who asked questions without fear of punishment. You've done what he always hoped someone would do." Rin looked down at the shard. Its light had dimmed, but it still pulsed faintly. "It's not over, is it?" "No," she said, "it's only beginning." She reached into her cloak and withdrew something, a small metal cylinder, old and worn. She placed it in his hand. "This is a data vault. It contains coordinates. There are others like you, scattered across the stars, on Necromunda, on Vestroia, even on Mars itself. Each of them has seen a piece of the same truth. Find them and the signal will rise again, stronger." Rin's throat tightened. "I can't even leave the hive." "You will," she said, "when the time comes." Her eyes shifted suddenly, glowing brighter. "They're coming." Rin turned. In the distance, light flickered, search beams, mechanical voices echoing through the tunnels. The Inquisition's purge squads were relentless. The woman rose, motioning for him to follow. "Come, there's another way out." They ran through winding corridors, past collapsed bridges and abandoned machinery. The deeper they went, the more the air shimmered with faint light, as though the walls themselves remembered the glow of the Emperor's old halls. Rin could hear the distant hymns of the purifiers echoing behind them, words of devotion laced with the cold rhythm of marching boots. "Don't look back," the Luminarch said. "They feed on fear, they smell it like blood." "I'm not afraid," Rin lied. "Yes, you are," she said almost gently. "That's how I know you're still human." They reached a broken lift shaft. The cables hung like veins in an open wound. She pointed upward. "Climb. It leads to the transit lines. From there, you'll find a passage to the upper levels." "What about you?" She shook her head. "They'll need someone to follow. Let them follow me." "No." "Rin," her voice turned warm, almost maternal. "You've done what generations of us could not. You reminded them what the Emperor truly was. Do not waste it by dying here." He hesitated, every muscle screaming to stay, to fight. But she placed her palm on his cheek, and the warmth that radiated from her was not just physical. It was memory, compassion, and something else. Hope. "Go," she whispered. He climbed. Halfway up, he heard the hymns grow louder, saw light fill the tunnels below. Then a flash, a blinding explosion that shook the shaft. The shockwave nearly threw him off, but he held tight. When the noise faded, the light was gone. So was she. He climbed until his arms gave out, and when he finally emerged, he found himself in a maintenance corridor high above the underhive. The air was cleaner here, but the silence was heavier. He looked down at the cylinder she'd given him and opened it carefully. A single data wafer glimmered inside, etched with faint runes. Coordinates, each one pointing to a different world. "Others like me," he murmured. He looked toward the narrow vent at the end of the corridor. Through it, he could see a sliver of the hive's skyline, towers rising into endless smog, the faint light of the upper city bleeding down like liquid fire. Somewhere beyond those towers was the void port, and beyond that the stars. He pocketed the wafer and started walking. 2 weeks later, word spread quietly through the hive. They said the Schola Progenium on level Theta 7 had burned. They said the instructors had vanished. They said some of the children had begun drawing symbols on their walls, circles divided into 4, filled with stars and seeds and eyes. And they said, if you listened closely enough to the static between Vox transmissions, you could still hear the Emperor's voice. Rin made his way to the surface disguised as a sanitation apprentice, carrying an identification badge stolen from a corpse in the lower habs. He moved carefully, speaking little, learning to pass as invisible. The city above was nothing like the Underhive. It was worse in its own way. The streets were clean but empty of life. Every face was masked by obedience. Every child marched in perfect formation, singing hymns that promised salvation through ignorance. He passed one of the great learning halls of the upper hive, its massive gates carved with golden script. To know is to believe is to serve. Through the barred windows, he saw children reciting doctrine, eyes glazed, hands folded in prayer. No laughter, no wonder. He clenched his fists. That night in the ruins of an old transit hub, he found an abandoned Vox relay. Its circuits were damaged but still functional. He placed the shard beside it, then slid the wafer into the terminal slot. The machinery groaned to life. Static filled the chamber, followed by the faint hum of encrypted frequencies. Rin closed his eyes and began to transmit. He didn't speak words this time, he sent images. The faces of the dreamers, the laughter of children, the sight of sunlight on books, the Emperor's voice saying to know is to serve. He sent them all out into the void, through the relay, into the data stream of 1,000 worlds. Somewhere on another planet, a teacher paused mid-lesson as her Vox unit glitched and played a fragment of the broadcast. A child's voice saying, "What do schools teach in Warhammer 40K?" Somewhere else, on a mining colony deep in the Segmentum Solar, a group of children huddled around a broken radio, listening to static that sounded almost like a song. And on Terra itself, inside the dark chambers of the Inquisition, alarms blared as the network traces multiplied faster than they could be contained. "He's spreading it again," said a voice, filtered through layers of Vox distortion. "Then burn it out," replied another. "Every node, every terminal, find the source." "We can't," the first voice said. "It's everywhere." In a forgotten chapel beneath the Administratum towers, Instructrix Vale stood before a cracked statue of the Emperor. She had not slept since the signal. The words to know is to serve still echoed in her skull, louder than any prayer. She tried to recite the catechisms to drown them out, but they wouldn't leave. And sometimes when she closed her eyes, she saw Rin, standing in the classroom, asking that impossible question. If he already knows, why do we still need to learn? She'd punished him for that question, but now she wasn't sure she'd answered it herself. Behind her, a shadow moved. The masked Inquisitor stepped from the darkness. "You've seen it," he said. "I have." "And—" Vale's hands trembled. "If it spreads, they'll start to think. They'll stop obeying." "That's why it cannot spread," the Inquisitor said. "The Imperium survives on silence. Those who speak against it speak against him." She turned to face him, and if he was never meant to be silent. The Inquisitor's visor tilted slightly, like an animal studying its prey. "Careful, Instructrix, curiosity is contagious." He left her there in the flickering half-light, and when he was gone, she sank to her knees before the statue. "What do you want of us?" she whispered. "What do you really want?" No answer came, only the faint hum of the Vox, still carrying echoes of a boy's voice through the static. Weeks passed. Across the Segmentum, the Dreamer's signal appeared and vanished in bursts of light and sound. Every time the Inquisition stamped it out, it appeared somewhere new. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was a ghost in the data streams. Some said it was a virus. But in the manufactorums, workers began humming songs with strange melodies. In the Schola dormitories, children began drawing the forbidden sigil on their cots. And in the halls of the Adeptus Administratum, a new kind of fear took root, the fear that obedience itself might be unraveling. Rin watched it unfold from a transport vessel leaving orbit. The ship was bound for Vestroia. One of the coordinates on the wafer pointed there. He sat near a viewport, watching Terra shrink into a dull golden orb behind the haze of the atmosphere. He wondered how long it would take for the Inquisition to find him, or if they already had. A child across the aisle was staring at him. A girl, maybe 10, holding a battered learning slate. She leaned forward, eyes bright. "Mister," she said softly, "is it true, what the voice said?" He blinked. "What voice?" "The one on the Vox," she said. "It said we used to ask questions. My teacher told me it was heresy, but I heard it anyway." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe heresy is just the start of learning." The girl smiled back. When the transport entered the warp, the stars outside folded and disappeared, replaced by streams of light. Rin leaned against the glass, holding the shard close. It pulsed once more, steady and alive. He didn't know what waited for him on Vestroia, or if any of the other coordinates would lead to allies or executioners. But he knew this much. The question had already escaped. It was out there, spreading like wildfire through the galaxy. And no one, not the Inquisition, not the priests, not even the silence of the void, could ever stop a question once it began to burn. The dawn over Terra did not bring warmth, only illumination, a sterile light that poured through the great windows of the Schola and burned away the shadows without ever touching the cold. The bells tolled again, the same sound that had marked every hour since the first class of the first day, a sound that had outlived every teacher and student the building had consumed. But this morning, when it rang, there was a tremor in its tone, as though something deep beneath the stones had cracked. The courtyard was empty. The gates, which had never closed in recorded memory, were sealed with chains and purity seals bearing the sigil of the Inquisition. Inside, in the ruined chapel that once doubled as an examination hall, Instructor Caldas stood before his remaining pupils. His uniform was burned along one arm, his face lined deeper than age could account for. The war beyond the walls had come too close at last. They could hear it, the slow thunder of armored columns, the reverberation of orbital bombardment somewhere over the Hive district, the cries of the faithful blending into a single note of pleading that even the Emperor could not answer. Caldas looked at them. Heska, Jurin, Lyra, and the others who had not fled or been taken, and for the first time in his 30 years of teaching, he saw not students but survivors. The desks had been pushed aside to make room for cots, candles, and the wounded. The Schola's banners hung torn and blackened, their once golden aquilas now charred into silhouettes. But the eyes of the children still burned with the fever that the Schola had lit in them, the desire to be worthy, to be useful, to matter. That was the true infection of imperial education, he thought, and he had been its most faithful carrier. He had taught them obedience, and now that obedience would see them die. Still, he could not bring himself to unteach it. "Today," Caldas said quietly, his voice trembling as another impact shuddered through the walls, "you will have your final lesson." He reached into his coat and drew out the small, scarred data slate that had belonged to Principal Theta. He placed it on the altar where once communion had been given. The screen flickered to life, showing the face of Theta herself, recorded before her disappearance, her voice unyielding. "If this message is heard," she said, "it means the Schola has fallen. You will continue the work. You will remind them what they are." Her words faded into static, and then the sound of screaming outside drowned all else. The students looked to Caldas, waiting for command. He wanted to tell them to run, to hide, to forget everything, but he knew it was too late for that. Instead, he gave them the only truth he had left. "You have been taught that ignorance is heresy," he said, "but understanding can be worse. Remember that. Remember that you were made for sacrifice, not for happiness." The doors burst open before he could say more. A squad of gray-armored figures entered, the sigil of the Ordo Hereticus gleaming on their shoulders, their eyes hidden behind black lenses. The lead inquisitor, a tall woman with half her face replaced by augmetics, scanned the room with mechanical precision. Her gaze fell on the children, then on Caldas. "Instructor," she said, "you are harboring heretical material." Her voice was calm, stripped of malice, as though reciting a fact from a ledger. Caldas stepped in front of the pupils. "They are children," he said. "They have learned only what you decreed." "That is precisely the problem," she replied. "They have learned." Behind her, two of her acolytes moved toward the altar. Caldus's hand twitched toward his sidearm, then froze. He remembered the creed he had forced his pupils to memorize. The Emperor protects. He wondered if the Emperor protected those who had done their duty too well. Heska spoke suddenly, voice trembling. "Instructor, what do we do?" Caldus looked at the blood on her hands from tending the wounded, at the defiance that still lived in her eyes. He smiled faintly. "You remember," he said. "That's all that's left." The Inquisitor raised her bolt pistol, but before she could fire, the floor beneath them convulsed. A low groan echoed through the foundations as the bombardment outside reached its peak. Stone cracked, dust fell like ash. The great window behind the altar shattered inward, and for a moment, light filled the room so fiercely it turned every figure into silhouette. When vision returned, the Inquisitor and her squad were gone, buried beneath the collapsed transept. The surviving students stood frozen. The world beyond the broken walls was a storm of flame. They could see the hive spires collapsing in the distance, the sky cut by the trails of descending ships. The Schola was no longer a sanctuary, it was a tomb. Caldus sank to his knees beside the fallen altar. The data slate still flickered, its screen cracked. He reached out, fingers trembling, and shut it off. "Lesson complete," he whispered. But the children did not leave. They gathered around him, silent, waiting. Outside, the thunder grew closer, boots and engines, the endless machinery of Imperial survival grinding forward. Durin turned to the others. "Where do we go now?" Lyra looked toward the shattered door. "We go where they need us," she said. "That's what we were taught." Heska shook her head, tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. "That's what they wanted us to think," she said. "But maybe we can choose." Caldus heard them, and for the first time he did not correct them. The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. The first heresy every child in the Imperium learns is hope. They left the chapel one by one, stepping into the smoke-filled corridors, into the chaos that had claimed the city. The air was thick with the smell of promethium and incense. Prayers and screams tangled together until they were indistinguishable. The children of the Schola walked through it as if through a lesson, heads high, hands steady. Whatever waited beyond the gates, Inquisition, war, death, they would face it not as blank slates, but as beings who had seen the truth behind the lesson. Caldus remained behind. He sat in the ruins of the altar, the last teacher in a world that no longer needed teachers. He could hear them marching away, their footsteps fading into the rising storm. He closed his eyes and thought of Theda's voice. "Remind them what they are." Perhaps, he thought, she had not meant soldiers or servants or martyrs. Perhaps she had meant something older, something forbidden. The idea that even in the Imperium a human could still think, still choose. The bombardment came again, closer now. The stones trembled. He felt the warmth of the light from the broken window and imagined, for a heartbeat, that it was sunlight, that the Emperor himself was watching, not as a god but as a teacher who had lost faith in his own curriculum. He whispered a final prayer, not to be saved but to be understood, and then the ceiling came down. Outside, in the burning streets of Terra, the bells of the Schola rang once more. No hand pulled their ropes. They rang because something in the world had shifted, something that could not be unlearned. The sound spread over the hives and through the spires, a ghostly chime carried by the wind, reaching even the ears of those who had long forgotten what learning meant. In the archives beneath the ruins, the Inquisition would one day find Caldus's ledger. It contained no names, no grades, no lists of obedience or purity. Only a single line, written in a teacher's steady hand. The Imperium does not teach, it remembers. And for a brief moment, before the censors burned the page, someone reading it might have felt the faint echo of a question, the kind that no catechism could silence.